plans for a no-fly zone are being talked up again by London and Washington. How well advanced are plans to arm the opposition directly? We'll hear from the Republican presidential contender John McCain and ask the high priest of the left, Noam Chomsky, if the West should intervene.
The West has an extremely ugly history there. We may not pay attention, but the people don't forget. For the powerful, history is bunk, but the victims don't have that luxury.
One blunder after another in Libya, and Tories begin to worry at their government's level of competence. Time for some public relations.
We understand that you have a bit of a rodent problem at number 10.
Don't talk about the cabinet like that.
Is this really the best way for David Cameron to fight back? Time to convene some political insiders on how Downing Street hopes to get a grip. Also tonight.
It's Rangers 3, Celtic 0 when the last whistle blows. In this battle of giants, a great victory.
How has the ancestral sectarian hatred between Rangers and Celtic been handed down from generation to generation? We can't stand aside and let Colonel Gaddafi do terrible things to his people, said the Prime Minister tonight, after a conversation with President Obama. A couple of hours ago, the White House said the two men had agreed to press ahead with planning for a range of responses, including a no-fly zone. But as Gaddafi's forces apparently advance, more voices on both sides of the Atlantic are calling for the rebels to be armed directly by the West. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But history offers plenty of cautionary tales. In a moment, we'll hear whether Senator John McCain thinks it's a good idea. But first, here's Tim Hewell.
What I am calling for is greater access for the Libyan opposition forces to modern weaponry.
There's no guarantee that by helping these people you'd necessarily bring about a more democratic outcome or a more desirable outcome.
The question is, what kind of arms will they supply and to whom would they supply them?
Britain's special forces may have suffered one setback with the bungled SAS operation in Libya last week, but the momentum's still building in the West for military intervention of some kind, including perhaps arming the rebels.
No, exactly what we're dealing with.
In Libya today, repeated bombing by government warplanes around the rebel-held oil town of Ras Lanuf marks the intensification of Colonel Gaddafi's drive to reconquer the east of his country. Opposition forces are determined, but still Gaddafi's forces are said to have attacked with artillery and tanks, leaving many casualties, including children. The government offensive is prompting ever more calls for outside intervention.
What I am calling for is greater access for the Libyan opposition forces to modern weaponry. And unless that modern weaponry is forthcoming quickly, it is likely that we will see the death toll in Libya of the opposition forces increase and indeed see women and children die as well.
Aside from the humanitarian impulse to save lives, there's also mounting concern in the West that without outside intervention, the Libyan revolution may ultimately be crushed. That would mean losing an historic chance to rid the world of one of its most dangerous and unpredictable dictators. Sending in Western troops would be militarily difficult and politically almost impossible. A no-fly zone's being considered, but it may not be practical or enough. That's why the idea of military aid is gaining ground. And the West's got plenty of experience, both open and covert, of arming rebels. In 1999, in the Balkans, the ethnic Albanian Kosovo Liberation Army received training, intelligence, and, it's alleged, arms from America, in addition to the support provided by NATO bombing raids on Serbia. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, both the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets and later the Northern Alliance fighting the Taliban received substantial support from the CIA and the Pentagon.
The Afghan model of warfighting was a very formative lesson for the US defense bureaucracy and particularly Donald Rumsfeld of warfighting, and that now could be revived.
The British Lion roars in Libya.
Britain's SAS was active in Libya 69 years ago, involved in an Allied assault on German and Italian-held Tobruk and Benghazi, though their part of the operation had to be aborted when their presence was discovered early on after a clash at a roadblock. But in eastern Libya now, it's local rebels, not outside powers, who are calling the shots, and they're determined to keep it that way. The risks of Western military aid are obvious. One, that the rebels themselves are very aware of, is that it would enable Colonel Gaddafi to portray the opposition as an agent of foreign powers. Another is that some supplies, particularly small arms, could easily fall into the wrong hands and be sold on to anti-Western militant groups in Africa and beyond. In any case, ammunition's something the rebels aren't short of. This huge arms dump and others have fallen into their hands. It's other things they need more, particularly communications equipment.
First of all, radios would help them organise a kind of defence we saw at Brega, where you have small disorganised units. Second, we're looking at anti-tank weapons, basically to stop rebels, to assist rebels in stopping Gaddafi's armoured units, which are far more sophisticated than anything the rebels have on hand. And thirdly, we're looking at anti-aircraft weaponry, particularly portable anti-aircraft weaponry.
Today, President Obama agreed with David Cameron to plan what they called a full spectrum of possible responses, including a no-fly zone. But there was no specific mention afterwards of arming rebels. That's still a controversial idea.
We don't know a lot about the opposition in Libya. It's different tribes, it's different individuals, and there's no guarantee that by helping these people you'd necessarily bring about a more democratic outcome or a more desirable outcome.
It's our uprising, the Libyan rebels insist. There'll be fierce arguments in Benghazi about what help to accept, but equally fierce arguments outside about what help to give.
Well, shortly before we came on air, I spoke to the former US presidential candidate, Senator John McCain. I asked him whether the international community was just going to stand idly by while Colonel Gaddafi kills his people.
Well, I hope not, and I appreciate the leadership that Prime Minister Cameron has shown, and also President Sarkozy, and unfortunately here in the United States it seems we are sounding an uncertain trumpet.
So what do you think we should do?
Well, obviously the first step would be a no-fly zone, and I'd like to, if I could, add a couple of comments about that. The air power of Gaddafi is confined to a relatively small place, 4 airfields around Tripoli. It's not as if you have to cover the entire country. Psychologically, if you tell Libyan pilots that if they fly, sooner or later they're going to die, they're not going to fly. And obviously the massacres or killings that are taking place from the air not only is killing innocent people, but it changes the battlefield equation, giving the Libyans an advantage that they otherwise wouldn't have. Finally, if Gaddafi is insane enough to bomb the oil facilities, you could have an environmental disaster of very
Now, that inevitably escalates the conflict.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure how efficient the air defenses are. They're Soviet-era equipment.
You want to take the risk?
Yes, indeed. Look, people are being massacred. Isn't it an obligation that the world has to stop a mad dictator from massacring his own people? And if we don't have the military capability to take on their air defenses and their air force, then we have wasted a great deal of American treasure.
Well, why waste?
We can handle the Libyan Air Force and the Libyan air defenses. I know we can.
Well, why stop then at simply a no-fly zone? Why not arm the rebels?
Well, I think you should consider getting weapons to them as one of all the options that are on the table.
But there's a UN arms embargo on arms to Libya.
Actually, that UN arms embargo applies only to the Libyans, is my interpretation of it, Jeremy. And I would say again, isn't it our obligation, if we can, to stop the slaughter of innocent people? And it seems to me that it is, and the world has acted in the past, and sometimes they haven't acted, as in the case of Srebrenica. and Rwanda and other places. I think you're going to find a lot of brutality has been practiced already by Gaddafi and his thugs.
Well, why stop at arming the rebels? Why not send in ground troops?
Because sending in ground troops would be counterproductive, would turn the Libyan people against us, and we all realize that. I would plan on humanitarian assistance. There's a huge humanitarian pleading with us to enact a no-fly zone.
How would you go about arming the rebels?
Well, I don't know exactly how, and I'm saying that that's one of the options, but one of the ways I think would be as the way we did in Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan, and that was we could get weapons into them. But the main thing right now, all those options have to be explored. The thing that has to be done right now is the no-fly zone enacted, because right now there are people being killed and massacred that are innocent people.
Are you really suggesting that a policy, a serious military policy, could be based on a Hollywood film?
We call what we did in Afghanistan, quote, Charlie Wilson's war. It is a ridiculous here, but the fact is that that is an option, as the Secretary of State has said. The President of the United States has said American policy is that Gaddafi must go. It seems to me a no-fly zone would help prevent what is maybe developing into a stalemate and significant casualties on the side of the people that would be inflicted on the people of Libya.
At that point, does it not become another example of America throwing its weight around, as opposed to being a struggle for people to have democratic rights?
Well, democratic rights go with the rights of people not to be massacred, number one. Number two is people on the ground are pleading for this no-fly zone, and they're also saying they don't want ground troops in there as well. They're very specific in what the United States should also act again, and we certainly have the capability to impose a no-fly zone.
Senator, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, the spectacle of a dictator using tanks, rockets and aircraft against people demanding freedoms we take for granted poses a challenge for people of all political stripes. But for the left, which has accused Western governments for years of being happy to countenance tyranny for the sake of oil and Israel, the issue is especially charged. In a moment, we'll hear from Noam Chomsky, seen by many on the left as the voice of their conscience. First, let's hear from Paul Mason, though.
The revolutions in North Africa and the Middle East have shattered the theory of a passive Arab world inured to dictatorship and enthralled to political Islam. But there's a challenge too for the worldview of the left. After 9/11, with the Afghan war and the invasion of Iraq, the world for the left became polarized between America and its enemies. Noam Chomsky, the professor of linguistics who became the global intellectual figurehead of the left, saw America itself as terrorist. America he described as a totalitarian state. Chomsky, who is Jewish, said Israel's invasion of Gaza was not only criminal but politicide, the systematic murder of a nation. All this prompted the English writer Christopher Hitchens to accuse Chomsky of accepting moral equivalence between the actions of the USA and of Al-Qaeda.
Don't attack! Don't attack Iraq!
For the best part of 20 years, the left's narrative on the Middle East has been dominated by imperialism and anti-imperialism. People, many of them Western educated, who didn't seem to hate America.
Yes, good, yes, good.
And this, too, has been the test of a new kind of American diplomacy. Under Obama, the USA has so far refrained from militarizing the situation and exercised soft power to speed the exit of men like Ben Ali and Mubarak. Chomsky, a giant of modern linguistics, claimed the media had become a machine for manufacturing consent. But these were revolutions driven by free access to information, the sudden impact of social media. The consent machine broke down. And it's been shaky in America, with 100,000 on the streets of Madison, Wisconsin, in defense of union rights. Chomsky describes himself as an anarchist or libertarian socialist, and in that he embodies the ideas that have become dominant on the left with the demise of Leninism and trade union power. Now, from Tahrir Square to Madison, Wisconsin, that left is faced with a new question. Once you've mobilized people power, what do you do with it?
Well, earlier I spoke to Professor Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, when you see all those thousands of people demonstrating on the streets of Egypt or Libya, what do you think?
Well, I think it's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, they have a lot of problems, internal and external. Notice that it's been a remarkable achievement so far, but the regimes are intact. There have been name changes, but no significant socioeconomic political changes, though they may come.
You talk about them demonstrating against regimes which enjoyed the backing of the West. Isn't it characteristic of these demonstrations that the West has, by and large, backed the demonstrators against the dictators?
Certainly not. In fact, what's happened is, following a standard game plan, which has been used over and over, Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Chun in South Korea, Suharto in Indonesia. I mean, there comes a point when you cannot support your favorite dictator any longer. And the same thing happens every time. It's happening here too. Support them as long as possible. When the judgment is it can't be done anymore, maybe the army's turned against them or whatever, come out with ringing declarations about your love of democracy and how you're on the side of the people, and then try to preserve the regime. Should have taken place a long time ago.
Sure.
Remember, these demonstrations are bursting out now, but things have been going on for a long time. So, for example, in Egypt, there have been very extensive, significant labor struggles for years. The January 25th movement was led by, the uprisings were led by a group called the April 6th group. Those are the ones, the tech-savvy young people. April 6th is a significant day. That was the date of a major strike and support action planned at the Mahala textile industries, which was broken up by force. That was a couple of years ago.
Do you find it striking that what many of these demonstrators appear to want is the sort of freedoms, Western freedoms, that you have often said are rather illusory?
Well, they're illusory if we let them be illusory. In fact, what's happening in Madison, Wisconsin, is very relevant in this respect. Right in the middle of the protest, one of the most dramatic moments of the protest a couple of weeks ago was when Kamal Abbas, a well-known labor leader in Egypt, sent a message to Madison, Wisconsin, saying the workers of Egypt support the workers of Madison in their struggle. In Madison, they're trying to preserve aspects of democracy that are under serious attack. In Egypt, they're trying to gain the rights that have been denied them. The trajectories are crossing, but going in opposite directions.
Do you think that the West should go as...
So, yes, no, of course not. But
what about Libya? Do you think we should arm?
Again, Libya's a special case. Libya's a civil war. Should the West intervene militarily? That's very doubtful. I don't think so. There's a long way before that question even arises. There are, first of all, the people don't want it. Remember that the West is hated for good reasons. I mean, take, say, Libya. Eastern Libya, which was just pretty much liberated, that's the site of the first post-World War I major genocide. Italy, in that case, that we may not remember, they do. And there's a long history since with England, France. For the powerful, the history is bunk. But the victims don't have that luxury.
So what do we do? Just do nothing?
We wait. And first of all, we're not asked to do anything. Mostly we've been asked to stay away. Just read what is being said. Mostly stay away. You've got the the question of what to do is not up to us. We're not the only ones in the world.
Sure.
So, say Brazil, for example, is a respected country. So is Turkey.
We know, because we've seen what you've had to say on the subject, how you regard Bush and Blair's record in the Middle East. Do you think Obama's no better?
In many ways, it's worse.
Why?
I've been writing about it. I started writing about it before the election.
Why is he worse?
Well, should we go through the details? Please. In the case of Afghanistan, he's sharply escalated the war. This is threatening a breakup of Pakistan, which could be a catastrophe for the West. Let's take Israel-Palestine. I mean, his position is shocking. He's refused to do. I mean, there was just a UN Security Council resolution a few weeks ago in which calling on an ending of settlement expansion, and declaring the settlements illegal, which is not even controversial. Obama vetoed it.
You famously said that every American president since the Second World War would fail in the judgment as applied at Nuremberg, and therefore effectively should be hanged. Do you say the same applies to...
I didn't say not everybody was hanged at Nuremberg. I said if we believed...
not everyone was hanged.
I said if we believed in the Nuremberg principles,
yes,
every American president would...
principles applied to him.
No, he's carrying out a major war in Afghanistan. He's supporting. He's directly involved in aggressive and criminal actions carried out by Israel, for example. He's only been in office for 2 years, so he hasn't a chance to invade anyone yet. But his record is quite consistent with what's happened before.
Professor Chomsky, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And you can watch the whole of that interview on our website now. Well, now, however the Libyan power struggle turns out, it hasn't done the Foreign Office any favours. There's been one calamity after another, culminating in the Foreign Secretary's acceptance of responsibility for the capture of Special Forces soldiers by a bunch of Libyan irregulars. The coalition came to power, of course, promising to end chaos in government. And the handling of the Libya crisis is but one example of how it's a lot easier to promise than to deliver. Even some of their own MPs are now getting rattled. Ian Watson reports.
The shifting sands of the Libyan crisis could be in danger of sweeping away any sense that the government's in control of events. The Foreign Secretary's friends give him credit for getting oil workers out of North Africa and getting aid in. But many in his own party say there's more than a grain of truth in the accusation that his political skills have been deserting him. Senior Conservative backbenchers have told Newsnight William Hague has lost his zing. It looks like his heart isn't in it any longer. He appears to have lost interest in foreign affairs, and that if he were to be moved from his current job, until recently there would have been an outcry on the backbenches. Now there'd be no clap.
I say to you very seriously that all of us who have taken on the job of shouldering responsibilities at this time must see those responsibilities through for an extended period of time.
There's a feeling of unease amongst some senior Conservatives at Westminster tonight. One of them told me that the government's reputation for competence had taken a bit of a blow in the past couple of months because of a series of apparent U-turns, but that it was the last 2 weeks which were the worst since taking office, and that's because the bungling bug has now apparently struck in the usually immune zone of foreign affairs.